Hello and welcome back to another Docker series tutorial. So this one is a walkthrough on how to set up a Docker Compose file for Django, Celery, Redis and Postgres database. So I am making a few assumptions here that you know a little bit about Django Celery, how to set up a simple worker, for example. I will go through it. I will go through every single step in this tutorial, but I might not give you the level of detail that you're expecting about everything here. So the core of this tutorial is the Docker Compose file, because that really is the glue that's going to stick everything together to build this environment so you can work within this Django, Celery and Redis Postgres environment. So this is what we're going to end up with. Containers, we've got the Redis container, the Postgres database, Django and Celery container. And that's all working nicely together to then, you can see here I've generated or run a task and we've just added some simple numbers together and we have an output of 4. So that's just showing that everything is working. So that's what we're working towards. So let's get going. So first up, let's just create a new project. I'm going to call this core and put it into this new folder called Django. So next up, we'll just go ahead and start a new app. I'll just call this app. There we go. So we've got an app there, and that's about it for the actual Django setup for now. So next up, let's build a new file. This is going to be a DockerFile. So we'll start with a new DockerFile. Inside of here, we're just going to define the fact that we're going to be utilizing a Python container. So I already have Docker installed. I've got some images already downloaded. So the Python image, Postgres and Redis. So that's all ready to go. If you don't have this downloaded, it's okay. Once we actually build this through Docker Compose, they will just get downloaded, of course. So inside Docker Compose, we're going to need to set up or define the fact that we want to use Python. I want to use Python 3. We can set some environment configurations. So for example, we can go ahead and utilize the Python unbuffered equals 1. So this is basically going to allow us to log messages immediately instead of it being buffered. So let's go ahead now and think about the next one. So we need a working directory. So set up a working directory. It's going to be in the user src and then app. So that's going to be our working directory in the container. So we want to have some applications installed. So we'll go ahead and run the copy. So here we're going to build a requirements text with all the applications or dependencies that we're going to need for this. And then finally, we want to then install them. So there we can just run a pip install R for requirements, and we're going to run the requirements text. So let's go ahead now and create a requirements text for this. So we're going to want to run Django. We're going to be utilizing a Postgres database, so the PSY copg2 binary. We're going to run Celery and Redis. So let's go ahead and create a requirements text. And then inside of here, we're just going to define 4 items. So I'll just paste this in. So we've got Django. Here I'm just defining the latest version between 3.0 and 4. This binary here for the connectivity for a Postgres database. Obviously, we're going to be utilizing Celery and Redis. So obviously, we can just go ahead and just select the latest versions. We don't have to define the actual values, of course. So now that's in place, we have that and that will be ready to install. So let's not forget this DockerFile is a text document. So we don't use a file extension here, in case you were wondering. This contains all the commands a user could call on the command line to assemble the image. So this is basically the commands that we're going to utilize to assemble the image. Obviously, we create the containers from the image. So now we know we're going to build a Python container eventually, it's going to have the requirements already installed. So our container is going to have the Django package installed, Celery and Redis. So that's all good to go. So let's go ahead now and build a Docker Compose file. So this is going to be a YML file. Or YAML file. So first of all, we're going to define the version. So the latest version as of developing this tutorial is 3.8. And now we need to find some services. So we're going to need a few different services here. So let's go ahead and complete this now. So first of all, we're going to define Django. And then what we're going to need to do now is define the build. So in this case, our build is dot. This is just referring to the fact that our build context is in the same directory here. So next up, we have the container name. So I've just named the container Django so that we can easily refer to it. So most of the times you might want to use the commands to, run commands, utilizing the ID of the container. By defining a name, it can be a little bit easier to apply commands to a name than it is to an ID, which can be fairly long. So now we have a command. So this command will be run. For example, when we create the container, we want to ensure that our Django server is running. So we run the Python manage run server, and we run that on the 000. By defining the quad zeros here, we mean listen on all interfaces. And so we will listen, or the Django server here will listen for connections on all IP addresses. So next up, we define a working volume for our Django application, which of course will be mirrored across to the container. So we can work here inside of our Visual Studio Code editor. Any changes that we make here will be changed on the actual container as well. So then we define some ports. So we bind our host 8000 port to Django. So we're going to be utilizing the 8000 port, just the default port that Django utilizes when we start. Of course, you can change that. And then we're going to set up some environment configurations. So what we're going to need, we don't need to do it. What we can do is set debug to 1. We can set up the allowed hosts. So we don't need to go in and configure the Django application. So this will just allow us to run or access our Django application from the loopback address 127. Then we're going to set up our Celery broker. So this is just a defined environment parameter we set up. So Redis is going to be utilizing 6379. That's the default port. Of course, again, we can change that. So have a look at the documentation for these additional parameters here, defining the database, and then potentially also then we can define the cache as well at the end here. So next up we have the backend. So Celery backend, we're going to be utilizing Redis. So we've defined the broker and the backend as Redis, and then we're going to say this depends on. So not only do we want to run Django, but we also have other services that this relies on. So we're going to need to set those up. So we're going to set up a Postgres database. We're not actually going to configure it in this tutorial. We're just going to show you a configuration if you wanted to use Postgres database. So now we have also another dependency of Redis. So we're going to also build a Redis service. So let's go ahead now and define our Celery service. So here we defined a Celery service. So we don't need to necessarily do this. We could just run Celery directly from this service here, but we've just broken this service down into a separate service. We're going to be utilizing the same build context, and we're going to run the command. So this will just get Celery started when we actually run the Docker Compose file. So that's just going to get Celery started when we fire this all up. And we can also define the same volume. So we're utilizing this volume here so we can make changes. And then this depends on the Django service and also Redis. Okay, so the next service is a database service. So we're going to use the image of the Postgres image. So like I said before, I've already downloaded this. It's already ready. If you don't have this, it will just get automatically downloaded. Okay, so this is the image that I'm going to be utilizing for this. So I also name it PGDB. Again, just a convenient name for me to access this service. And I can then set up some environment variables. So you can follow the, if you go over to the Docker Hub, just have a look at some of the environment configurations that you can apply. So here I've just created a database called Postgres, user Postgres, password Postgres. And here I'm going to set up a volume, a named volume. So I've got my named volume here, PG data. So this just allows me to store the database data in a named volume. If you're not too sure what volumes are, check out the previous tutorials. And then I can go ahead and now set out my Redis service. So with Redis, all I need to do here is define, all I've done here is to define the version of Redis I want to use. So Alpine is just a slimline Linux package that Redis is going to run on top of. So this again is just an optional thing. Have a look at the Docker Hub for all the different options that are available here. So finally, I'm just going to define the volume because I've set up a volume reference here. So I just need to define that volume and we're ready to go. So that's pretty much it for the configuration. We've configured the database with a volume, persistent volume. We've got Redis defined here. So with Redis, I think the image comes when you run the container, Redis will just start automatically. So we've got Celery here, and we've also defined the Django service, which is going to be run on top of the Python image. Okay. So just to get things working once this service is started, I've created the app folder here, if you remember. So let's just make sure that we've added that into the installed apps. And then what we're going to need to do also is just set some more configuration options here so that we can connect to our Redis service. So we want to configure two options. One is the Celery broker URL. And so the next one here is going to be the Celery result backend. So we can set up these two configurations right here. Now, you notice that OS dependency is missing, so let's just go ahead and just import OS. Okay, so now that's in place. Right, so that just connects everything up nicely with the Redis package or service, sorry. So what I need to do now is I need to make a new file here called Celery. So let's just define a really simple Celery instance. So please head over to the Celery tutorial series in this channel if you want to learn a little bit more about Celery, but I'll just breeze through this. So we've got some imports here. We're just setting up our Celery parameters so that we can run Celery and just run a simple test or a simple service. So let's go ahead and obviously we're going to be utilizing the core settings. So we bring in core and then we set out auto discovery tasks. So it just automatically finds any tasks that we have in our application. So we're not going to define them individually. And that's about it. So we've set up Celery there. So let's just go over into the apps and let's just create a new file here called tasks. So we're just going to set out a really simple task here. So we want to run from Celery import shared tasks because we want to run a shared task. And then we're just going to run a simple addition task. So we've just got two numbers that we're going to take in, and then we're going to add them up and return them. And then finally, in the init file here in the core, just allow Django to find this all automatically. So we add some code there. Right, so that's pretty much it what we need to configure just to get this working in a really simple standard way. Right, so let's go ahead now and actually run this. So let's go ahead and fire this up. So Docker compose run. And then what we want to do is define what we want to run. So in this case, we want to run Django. So let's do that. So that would take a couple of seconds to do that. Okay, so once we've done, I'm just going to close that, turn this all back on. So Docker compose and up. So I just wanted to show you this. So once we build this, you can see that all these services are being turned on here. And we've got the Redis server, the Postgres database. We've got Celery here. Says error, no such option app. Okay, so just look in the requirements file. I didn't actually specify the version of Celery. So this is going to be utilizing the latest version, which is, as of recording, Celery 5.0. So just go back into the Docker compose file here. The command to actually run Celery is slightly different. So we're going to use the A switch here to find the name, in this case core. So the app equals Celery core. And then run the worker. And then we're going to use the L switch or flag and then info. You have to be really careful here because, for example, in the documentation, it will have a lowercase info, but that will cause an error. It needs to be capitalized, sorry. So that should run the worker now. Right, so let's go ahead and try this out. So let's just go ahead and rebuild. Close that, Control C, and then I'll do a compose up. So I've just closed that and then compose up, and that should just take us through the process and show us everything coming up. Here we go. So there we go. So if I scroll to the top here, you can see that Redis is Django is started, running on the 8000 port. Then we have Redis. And then further down here, Redis is now set up. We've got a database set up, so that's now configured. And Redis comes in again. And down here we have Celery. So Celery has been started. It's running. You can see the tasks that are available are the task add, and that's obviously the simple task that we created here in the task file. If I can just get that. There we go. So everything is running nicely. It says here that, for example, it defines the backend. So we've got the app, the transport, and the results. It's all defining Redis. So that looks like it's all working. If it couldn't find the backend, it would tell you. If there was a problem between Celery and Redis, then Celery would output an error. So everything looks okay. So let's go back into the command prompt and just test this out. Let's open up a new command prompt, and let's go into the Django instance. So Docker exec, and then we're just going to name it Django. So we're not using the container ID, just the container name, because that's what we've named it. If you go into the containers, we've named it Django. Okay, so let's go into the shell. And now let's just go into the Python shell. So this will enable us to then actually run a Celery task. So let's just import the task first. So from the app dot tasks import, and we want to import add. So now we have that. We can now run a simple task. So let's run add delay, and then 2 and 2. So here we're just sending across the two parameters 2 and 2, and then we're just obviously going to add them up, and that's going to be the result. So if we fire that off, you can see that we've got an async result. If we go back into the Docker Compose here and just bring up the Celery at the bottom here, you can see that it's received the task. It was successful, and the end result was 4. 2 plus 2 is 4. So clearly everything is working nicely. And there we have it: Docker Compose, Django Celery, Postgres database, and Redis.